Thank you, Andrea. Welcome, everyone. Good morning. As many of you know, my name is Dr. Robert Hess, and I am one of the faculty physicians here within the UCSD Movement Disorders family. I've been tasked today to give a brief overview of Parkinson's disease and dive a little bit deeper into living with Parkinson's. This will cover the broad brushstrokes of the disease and by no means is all-encompassing. Before I get started, I want to say thank you again for this opportunity to be here with you all. I'm looking forward to continue learning about your experiences with Parkinson's and how we can work together to improve quality of life with Parkinson's. So without further ado, a brief overview of our objectives or our goals today during our talk. We'll do a brief overview of the general characteristics and features of Parkinson's. We'll cover a brief history lesson, epidemiology or statistics about Parkinson's, mechanisms of the disease, which is just our term for how Parkinson's works, why Parkinson's disease occurs, at least the theories about how Parkinson's works. The clinical features or symptoms, both with movement as well as non-motor symptoms that occur in Parkinson's. And then we'll close out with frequently asked questions and common myths about Parkinson's, its treatments that I hear in the clinic all the time. And hopefully, and if you have these questions, that will kind of nip them in the bud and get these questions answered. So as I mentioned, we'll start with a brief history of Parkinson's. I apologize, please indulge me. I was a history major in my undergrad years, so I would be remiss if I skipped an opportunity for a brief history lesson. So going way back to the 3rd century BCE, the first known mention of Parkinson's disease was by an Indian scholar, Charaka, who described the motor and non-motor features of Parkinson's, including tremor, slow movement, gait imbalance, and even depression. He termed this Kampavada, which was from the ancient Sanskrit, the name for tremor, Kampa, and the spiritual force Vada, which was thought to be out of balance. He even came up with treatments with a mixture of several different plants, seeds, including one called Atmagupta. Atmagupta, otherwise known as Mucuna pruriens, actually contains 4 to 6% of a dopamine substrate. As many of you know and we'll cover later, dopamine is the hallmark of therapy for Parkinson's. So I mentioned this just because I couldn't resist such a cool fact. I don't recommend this as a replacement for our medicines. It is not as potent as our medicines to help with symptoms. If it were, I would have had planted it in my backyard, but I just thought it was too cool not to mention. Fast forwarding all the way to 1817, this is the hallmark paper from James Parkinson called An Essay of the Shaking Palsy, where he published his clinical observations of people in the streets of London, noted tremor, slowness of movement, as well as constipation as being very common. So this was kind of our landmark paper. Going forward to 1872, Jean-Martin Charcot, one of our fathers of neurology in general, dove a little further to defining Parkinson's disease, suggesting there was 2 different models of the disease, one with tremor, the shaking of the hands, and one with bradykinesia. You'll hear me use bradykinesia quite often. It's the Latin for slow movement, and we'll dive a little deeper into what that means too. He was the first to recommend that this syndrome be named Parkinson's disease. And I want to make a point that at that time, we still note that Parkinson's disease, there's not a weakness of the muscles. The muscles retain their power. It is more trouble with the coordination of speed of movement that's going on. And finally, he noted the difference between an action tremor, when we're using our hands, like holding glasses of water, pouring a cup of coffee, writing, handwriting, versus a rest tremor, where when we're sitting on the couch doing nothing, the hand is shaking by itself. And it's that rest tremor that is correlated with Parkinson's disease. Finally, I promised last slide of history. In 1895, Richer and Mage created detailed drawings and statues of patients with Parkinson's to help other physicians know what to look for and how to recognize. Brissot proposed the substantia nigra, which is a small portion within the brainstem, as the quote anatomical seat of Parkinson's. In 1953, Greenfield of Bosanquet demonstrate that there were pathological brainstem lesions, confirming what Brissot had theorized in 1925. And then finally, in 1967, Honen Yar published their international staging system, which I promise we'll discuss more later, and what that means and how we use it in the study of Parkinson's. Some epidemiology or statistics of Parkinson's disease. It is the second most common neurodegenerative disease in the United States after Alzheimer's. So you can see the prevalence is about 0.5 to 1% in ages 65 to 69 of the whole population, and 1 to 3% in ages 80 and higher. So this tells us, and still remains, age is the strongest correlative factor for Parkinson's that we have. Men are 1.5 times more likely to develop Parkinson's, and currently about 1 million people are living with Parkinson's in the United States today. This is expected to rise to 1.2 million by 2030, with around 90,000 people diagnosed every year across the world with Parkinson's. So I know this is a large numbers, and unfortunately they are growing, but I want the takeaway to be more so that you are not alone, that there is a large community out there. There's lots of support and resources. Like, I'm lucky to be at UCSD, but there's other associations like the Michael J. Fox Foundation, Parkinson's Association of San Diego, that are really out there to help all of us. So what is Parkinson's disease? The current definition is as below: progressive disease characterized by tremor, rigidity, bradykinesia, that slowness of movement, with balance issues. However, this is constantly evolving, constantly changing as we're learning more about Parkinson's, as we're getting more biomarkers, which we'll touch about a little bit later, new imaging studies, and this definition should change and will change. These key features, that bradykinesia, slowness of movement, is the hallmark. And that's when, if you've been with me in the clinic, we do our finger tap testing and opening and closing your hands, and we see that those movements start to decrement, or they start to get smaller and smaller as those repeated movements are done. And then supportive features are the tremor, rigidity, and postural instability, or the balance issues. I have a list over there of some atypical symptoms. I just wrote them there because these are things your physician or your team of physicians should be looking for to make sure we are dealing with Parkinson's and not something that might look like Parkinson's or present similarly. And then there's supportive features. For example, typically with Parkinson's, the left or the right side of the body is more affected, and of note, that does not matter your handedness. So if you're right-handed, you're not more likely to have issues on the right side. And then finally, patients with Parkinson's disease, we like to see that they respond to our medicine, that our levodopa replacements that we'll cover do help with the symptoms and help treat tremor and slowness of movement. A little bit of a busy slide, but this is an idea and a proposed theory of how we think about Parkinson's, especially in the research world too. That there's this prodromal phase, or this phase of Parkinson's where there's no tremor or slowness in movement, but some other symptoms like REM sleep behavior disorder, lack of sense of smell, that we'll cover later. And I bring this up because these are important markers that might predict future Parkinson's. And it's these patients that obviously we want to really intervene on to try and prevent the development of motor symptoms. I want to make a point that this is not the only phase where research is going on. There's plenty of research in the clinical phase when there are motor symptoms, tremor, slowness of movement, that those are active areas of research, and they're not just focusing on the prodromal phase. So how does Parkinson's disease work? I have highlighted here that something called alpha-synuclein, this protein that misfolds and aggregates in the neurons. We'll cover that in a second. But here are some other, at least, proposed contributing or combined mechanisms of disease, or how we think Parkinson's might work. in terms of clearing out that protein, dysfunction in the kind of the body's way of clearing out diseased proteins or misfolded proteins. Neuroinflammation or general inflammation that we have, the rest of our body can occur in the nervous system as well. And then mitochondrial dysfunction. The mitochondria is the powerhouse of our cell. It provides the energy for our cells to live. And there's been found that in certain rare genetic forms of Parkinson's that the mitochondria are affected. So there is some suggestion that this is contributing or may contribute to the development of Parkinson's. So, as promised, that alpha-synuclein is the name of the protein, or Lewy body is the other name, as you may have read. This protein starts to misfold. And as it misfolds, it causes other alpha-synuclein proteins to misfold as well. In doing that, they start to aggregate together or clump together. As they clump more and more, they start to interrupt the machinery of the neuron, causing neuronal damage and eventually neuronal death. This is all important in terms of our basal ganglia. So getting a little bit into neuroanatomy here, so I apologize if there's any yawns at this point. But the basal ganglia is a collection of structures in the brain that all working together give us our coordination and speed of movement, kind of that system of movement rather than power. It's in the substantia nigra, like we chatted about in 1925, that Berceau had postulated was the seat of Parkinson's disease. It's number 5 there in the cartoon. That's where the alpha-synuclein starts to build up. And as those neurons unfortunately die off, those neurons are ones that produce dopamine. And I like to think of dopamine as the fuel for the basal ganglia. So as it's trying to communicate with each other, with the rest of the brain, to coordinate that speed and coordination of movement, that dopamine starts to run low and the basal ganglia is not working as well. And that's when we get these symptoms of tremor and slowness of movement. This is a proposed theory of how Parkinson's spreads in stages 1 and 2 of the Braak staging system. So they theorize how Parkinson's or the alpha-synuclein starts to misfold in the olfactory bulb, or kind of our main sense of smell area of the brain, or even down lower. There's other theories proposed that Parkinson's may start in the gut, and that they're, again, that hallmark of constipation or a very common symptom of constipation with Parkinson's can then lead to this alpha-synuclein misfolding and aggregating. And as we progress through the stages, that alpha-synuclein spreads to different portions of the brain and contributes to symptoms when they get to different portions of the brain. Kind of summing it all up, the vast majority of cases, we do not find a singular cause for Parkinson's. Current theories include a combination of environmental and genetic factors contributing to the development of disease, progression, and symptomatology. However, as many of you may have heard me say, or other physicians say, if you have seen one patient with Parkinson's, you have seen one patient. Everyone has a very different journey with Parkinson's, and that's kind of what has made development of treatments or therapies somewhat difficult for this disease. So why does Parkinson's disease occur? I'll kind of jump to the genetics. So around 15% of Parkinson's patients report a family history of Parkinson's. So a significant amount, but definitely the minority. So meaning most patients with Parkinson's, it's something called sporadic, or we don't have any family history with Parkinson's. 3 to 5% have a known single cause. There's a list of a couple of genes there, definitely not exhaustive, that are related to Parkinson's. Then 16 to 36% of patients have a non-heritable genetic risk factor that impart at least some risk of Parkinson's. And to date, there's been found over 100 genetic loci or locations within the genes that impart some amount of risk. And that's kind of how I like to think about the genetics, that they don't necessarily mean we will develop Parkinson's, but they impart a higher risk. So getting more towards the clinical features or the symptoms of Parkinson's disease. Again, these are the most common symptoms. They are not exhaustive of all of the symptoms, but the goal of this is to make sure we're talking about them, recognizing them, because there's a lot of therapies and both pharmaceutical and non-pharmaceutical to help with these. So first off, the most prominent of our symptoms, tremor. Generally is asymmetric, like I mentioned before, either left or right side of the body is more commonly affected, and usually the arms are more affected than the legs. That bradykinesia or slow movement, like we said, are finger taps, open, closing, that decrement or getting those repetitive movements getting smaller. Rigidity, stiffness of the arms and legs rather than having the idea of an increased tone of the arms and legs. And postural instability. Some people term this as freezing of gait, shuffling gait, or festinating steps is another term. That festinating steps means those quick, small steps as you're getting going. And these are just a handful of the motor symptoms of Parkinson's. Now to go into more the non-motor symptoms. I want to make sure that we cover these because, again, trying to normalize all of these symptoms because they can be helped with therapies. First off is that REM sleep behavior disorder I briefly mentioned before, or RBD. Typically, our REM phase of sleep, rapid eye movements, REM phase of sleep is when we have dreams and we're supposed to be paralyzed or not be able to act out those dreams. In RBD, that mechanism malfunctions and you start to act out your dreams, including speaking, talking, yelling, even kicking, punching, running marathons. So it's something that is very common in Parkinson's, and it's something that can be predictive of Parkinson's down the road. It's been found to be very specific and have a high predictive power of potentially developing Parkinson's down the road. So it's important that we recognize this early. I want to caution that there are other sleep disorders that may look like this, things like PTSD or something called periodic limb movement disorders in your sleep. So it's important that a sleep study help confirm this diagnosis. But if you've heard of this going on, it's an important symptom for us to know. Constipation. Unfortunately, most of America is constipated all the time, so this symptom is not very specific to Parkinson's disease, but it's extremely common, both before, during, and during Parkinson's. It's usually slow transit. Things are moving slowly through the gut, and it's important that we address this both for overall comfort, as we all know, constipation is not enjoyable. And it's something that really affects our quality of life. But also, if we are addressing constipation and things are moving better, our medicines work better too. Urinary symptoms. Most commonly, this is frequency and urgency, especially overnight. It's a common symptom as we get older too, but Parkinson's can impart this as well. This also can affect our quality of life. If we're getting up all the time in the middle of the night, we're not getting as good of sleep or as good of quality of sleep. So it's important to let us know, because things like lifestyle modifications as well as medicines can help with this, and even establishing care with a urologist can be beneficial. This is something I want to make sure to highlight especially and make a special note of. So mood changes are extremely common in Parkinson's, both depression, anxiety, apathy, lack of motivation. These are things that can be chemically related to Parkinson's disease and not just situational. And I want to make sure we're talking about this, not feeling guilty about having these feelings. In a sample of around 1,000 patients, 36% reported depression. So 1/3 of patients had some mood changes. And it's important to recognize because this does affect quality of life, both for the patient, for you, as well as for your caregiver and your family and friends. There's pharmaceutical and non-pharmaceutical approaches to this. So I want to normalize this discussion as mental health is becoming more and more recognized as an important part of our overall health, that we're talking about it and not feeling ashamed or guilty about it. Some symptoms that are a bit later in Parkinson's disease. Blood pressure. If you've been to our clinic, you know that we usually take your blood pressure both sitting and standing because we're worried about lightheadedness, feeling of faint, vision darkening, because that puts you at risk of falls. As Parkinson's progresses, our blood pressure, control of our blood pressure becomes more difficult, and we'll see larger fluctuations in blood pressures. So that's why we look for it. And there's things that can be done about it. Most commonly, we can reduce our anti-blood pressure medicines, things that are trying to lower the blood pressure further. Other things that are non-medicine based, like drinking more water, eating salty foods, keeping the head of the bed elevated when you're asleep, can help with this. And it's something we're always thinking about, worrying about, because we want to maintain those good blood pressures for walking, standing, sitting, sleeping. Hallucinations and delusions. These are most commonly visual and tend to start with something like a sense of presence of someone or something over your shoulder, seeing something out of the corner of your eye, and when you look at it, it's not there, all the way to more formed hallucinations, looking at a hardwood floor and seeing the lines kind of move or wave, or even fully formed people and animals. This can be a part of the disease itself, part of Parkinson's, as that alpha-synuclein spreads to different parts of the brain. But also our medications can make this worse and or exacerbate them. So it's important to let your team know and let your family know if you're having these, because we can address them. And there's lots of things we can do to help. Swallowing difficulties, typically occurring later in the disease. Evaluation by speech therapy and diagnostic studies are recommended, as certain dietary modifications might be recommended to help to avoid any coughing, choking, especially things going down the wrong pipe that could contribute to a pneumonia. And importantly, falls. Kind of the main thing we ask every time we see you, something we're all afraid of, because we all know it just takes one bad fall to really change your quality of life and change how you live your life. So prevention is key. Several factors that contribute to a person's fall risk: bradykinesia, slowness in movement, freezing of gait imbalance, and improper assistive devices. So here on the left, I have something called a U-step walker. There's pros and cons to this. The reasons I like it is that it is a little bit heavier compared to those aluminum four-wheeled walkers. A lot of our patients tend to have backward falls, and that aluminum walker will just go right back with you. And that's what makes all of us a little bit nervous. The U-step walker is heavier and will not allow you to do that. That is the double-edged sword of it, though. It is heavier and can be a little bit harder to maneuver, especially in and out of a car. And then lastly, it has grip. So if you squeeze the handles to go and you let go to stay. So you always are sure where you're ready to go because you have to grip to go. All that being said, physical therapy and exercise are paramount. All right, kind of the second portion of my talk, I wanted to go over frequently asked questions that I hear in clinic all the time, or common myths that I've heard about Parkinson's disease, to kind of bring these out into the open and make sure we're chatting about them. So number one, is it better to wait to start carbidopa-levodopa, or Sinemet, the other name, or other dopamine replacement medications? So that was a theory for a long time, but I want to say it is not, this theory is not true anymore. It is the length of time of disease, not the length of time of levodopa use, that increases the risk for motor fluctuations, or dyskinesias, those extra wiggle movements that some people can have. So I'll say it again, it is the length of time of disease, not the length of time of levodopa use that increases that risk. So I want us to no longer be afraid of this medicine because it really can help with symptoms. Just to make sure it's clear, levodopa equals dopamine. So we're trying to give back that dopamine that we chatted about before that's low in the brain, trying to give back that fuel for the basal ganglia to work and help with the speed and coordination of movement. Carbidopa levodopa was first developed in 1975, and it's a combination medicine that is much too long to say. It was designed to reduce nausea and increase the amount of levodopa that gets into the brain to help with symptoms. So that's the reason for the much too long of name. We're fortunate that it really does not interact with other medications, and it does remain our gold standard therapy for Parkinson's. Question 2, what stage of Parkinson's am I in? So going over briefly, as I promised, this is the Hoehn-Yahr scale. Quickly, stage 1 is symptoms on one side of the body. Stage 2 is symptoms on both sides of the body. Stage 3 is some mild balance trouble. Stage 4 is more significant balance trouble, but still able to walk. And stage 5 is wheelchair bound. So this scale was designed for research purposes. This is designed for our researchers to see how Parkinson's, our medications, treatments affect patients with Parkinson's. This does not impart a predictable or steady progression through the stages. This is not like the stages of cancer. So I want to devalue almost the staging system for their use in the clinic because it does not mean all that much when we're assessing you. Question 3, is Parkinson's disease fatal? No. In of itself, Parkinson's disease is not fatal. The vast majority of patients pass away with Parkinson's disease, not because of it. Things we talked about that are the greatest risk to your health are the falls and the swallowing troubles. So that's why we ask about those all the time to make sure we prevent and treat as best we can. But I did just wanted to make it a point that Parkinson's disease is not in of itself fatal. Question 4, is there anything that can slow down Parkinson's disease? So researchers are tirelessly working on finding anything that can slow down, halt, reverse, or even prevent Parkinson's disease. To date, the only evidence-based medicine proof that we have that does slow down Parkinson's disease is exercise. As I'm sure many of you have heard me say or heard others say, or close out, that exercise is the most important thing in Parkinson's disease. So I want to make sure to stress that too. Just rapid fire, some other things that are in the works that are trying to assess the core of Parkinson's disease, things like monoclonal antibody therapies against alpha-synuclein. What that means is using our own immune system to help clear out those misfolded proteins and help clear them out of the brain and save the neurons. Stem cell therapies, medicines to decrease the breakdown of dopamine, medicines to increase the production of dopamine, anti-inflammatories, and even genetic therapies too. And finally, are there cognitive changes in Parkinson's disease? Studies have shown about 20 to 50% of patients develop mild cognitive impairment. While this is not a low number, it is by no means everyone. So I wanted to kind of debunk that idea that cognitive changes are a given with Parkinson's disease. And only a small portion, or only a portion of the 20 to 50% go on to develop dementia. And dementia, the definition is just cognitive changes or troubles that affect our daily lives. That's an umbrella term. It's not a specific diagnosis of itself. So I wanted to kind of mention this, that it is not a foregone conclusion that there will be cognitive changes in Parkinson's. So what's next? Things I didn't cover as much in this presentation are the research and what's going on in the Parkinson's disease world. We're fortunate that there's so many foundations out there that are tirelessly working to find ways to prevent, treat, reverse, slow down Parkinson's disease. To kind of close out, my main goal and our main goal in the clinic is to work on quality of life. That is what we're in the business of doing. So make sure to share what's important to you, what's important to your friends and family. And that's what we want to try to help you with in clinic, because quality of life is what I'm passionate about, what we're all passionate about. And I want to make every day just a little bit better, however we can. So thank you so much for your time and attention. I hope this talk helped answer some questions about what Parkinson's is and debunk some myths along the way. I look forward to continue working with you all, or meeting some of you, and working with you all to fight this disease and to improve quality of life.
Thank you, Dr. Hess.